OG Rose, and today I'm going to be talking about Drive My Car, a 2021 film. I've been inspired in wanting to see this film. I've heard a lot about it, and I know David, Javier have done a conversation about it. Inspired to watch it with Mr. Zaruba, Zeb, Thomas, Alex. I've been wanting to see this film, and I just finished it. And I have to say, Drive My Car is about Lacan. It might be the greatest representation of Lacan's thought I have ever seen. It is screaming psychoanalysis. It was a very impressive representation of Lacan's thinking. There's just many details. For example, the credits don't start till 40 minutes in, which suggests that the first 40 minutes are a giant prologue that then becomes a kind of lac around which the entire story is operating. The entire movie is constantly dealing with the interplay between the symbolic, imaginary, and real. I've always appreciated Murakami's novels like The Watchbird Chronicle, Dance, 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 Kafka by the Shore. His stories have a dreamlike element where you enter in and you really do feel like you enter into an other world. Murakami is a famous runner. He associates running and writing as being strongly connected. That comes out in his nonfiction. And there's a kind of entering into a other world. And famously, you feel getting pulled into this other world in Murakami. And it is very impressive work. The movie Drive My Car by Hamaguchi is inspired by the short stories of Murakami, the short story collection Men Without Women. And the movie Drive My Car puts together a few of the short stories. I think, if I recall, I would say three, maybe. Or two, definitely two, but maybe three. And there's a short story in there called Drive My Car. And there's another that starts with an S. And the one that starts with an S is where we see more of a female who tells stories after sex. And she talks about this sea creature that latches onto things. And about invading, going into someone's room, wanting to leave something behind, these elements that we see of the wife in Drive My Car, where that is not present in the story Drive My Car. Also, I think the Lacanian take that I'm so compelled by with this movie comes out in the movie, as opposed to perhaps the short stories. The short stories, there's a lot more exposition. The inner lives of the protagonists are known and made explicit, which works, I think, against a understanding of the story in terms of, say, lack of the symbolic, imaginary, and the real, of avoiding the real, because the stories are much more exposition, but that's just part of what comes with the medium. For me, what just strikes me as the best representation of Lacan I've ever seen in art seems to be a product of the work of Hamaguchi, the director, from the material of Murakami. And he somehow has put the material of Murakami in a manner together to make this extraordinary story that is the best representation of Lacan's thought I've ever seen. The elements, I think, are there to be put together thanks to Murakami, but the director has put them together to bring out the Lacan. And if the director has read Lacan or not, I'm not sure, but he, perhaps simply because he has a very profound understanding of human nature, that he's come upon a tale that feels so deeply indebted, so deeply inspired by Lacan, which would perhaps just be evidence that what Lacan teaches us is in fact real, because someone doing their own work will come to a story so much like Lacan on their own. But the director seems to have used Murakami to create this extraordinary Lacanian story. So in Lacan, to speak very generally, you have the notion of the imaginary, which you can associate with the mirror stage and the formation of the ego. It's the stories we tell ourselves by which to get through our day. The symbolic is the social order that is... All of this is concealing us from the quote-unquote real, which we're always trying to run from, which is indeed often that lack. The real is lacking from us, and if we get too close to the real, it overwhelms us, and we don't like it. So the symbolic functions to keep us from the real, the imaginary works to keep us from the real, and there is indeed a lot of overlap between imaginary and symbolic in Lacan, but they're not the same. And there's arguments to be made that the early Lacan has a different take on the imaginary than the latter Lacan. I am not enough of an expert on the field to say. But the main point is that we are constantly engaged in games of avoiding the real. And I will say a lot of the great writers, indeed, follow Lacan's thinking. And I was very impressed to see that the story orbited around Chekhov's short story, Uncle Varna. Many of the Russians were indeed great psychoanalytical thinkers. Dostoevsky being a prime example, to the point where Freud even thought Dostoevsky was greater than Shakespeare. And, Harold Bloom laughs at this point. But really, you do see in the Russians, like Chekhov and Dostoevsky particularly. I think Tolstoy is a great sociologist. And I think probably Tolstoy is a better writer than Dostoevsky. Just take the scene where they're cutting the fields. I think Anna Karenina, that always gets me, that part where he goes to cut the fields, and where the baby is just born in Anna Karenina and the responses. So Tolstoy is an unbelievable, and there is a certain depth to Tolstoy. I don't mean to say there is not. But if we go into the deep psychoanalytical, something that borders on the interest of a Freud and a Lacan, then you're going to be looking at a Chekhov and Dostoevsky. So I thought it was very fitting that a play by Chekhov was at the center of the film. I thought it was also very fitting that the movie started with Waiting for Godot, which is Samuel Beckett's masterpiece. And there is a sense of waiting for the real. When is the real going to show up? Do we want the real to show up? And then, of course, it ends with the part in Uncle Var where they're talking about one day our suffering will be worth it and God will come. And the question is, will it, or will it just be a great waiting for Godot? But the reason why this story kind of takes it to the next level is you have that line that we'll return to where it says, even if it was acting from the bottom of his heart. Even if it was acting from the bottom of his heart, where you're kind of breaking the line between the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, and they're all coming together. And it's very powerful, and there's this notion that perhaps even if religion is fake, it's acting from the bottom of our heart. And maybe the best any of us can do is act from the bottom of our heart, because we simply can't get to the real. We can't handle it. We're always stuck in the symbolic and the imaginary. And maybe we can get better degrees of the real, but we can never fully get there. The best we can do is act from the bottom of our heart. The main character, his wife dies in the story before his wife dies. Now, this is going to be full of spoilers. I believe I have not given any spoiler. Well, I have, I suppose, with the ending and so on. But if you are listening to this, this is going to spoil everything, so do be careful. So the main character is his wife. She comes up with her stories during the act of sex, and they lose their daughter, and she's not able to really function. She's very lethargic until one day during the act of sex, he starts narrating a story. This is, of course, very Lacanian. Much of our imaginary and symbolic is tied to sex, and sex kind of is the source that generates the stories by which we avoid the real, which is very interesting. Because sex is supposed to be the orgasmic, it's kind of the great heaven moment, the orgasmic purity, but it actually becomes the source of the stories by which we avoid the real. And this also would tie into Alexander Zupantra, where she kind of talks about how the punishment of the fall is sex, because sex is where you have to accept that two people can never become fully one. And so the movie will do a very good job of showing how sex is a punishment, because then the husband catches his wife in an affair. And what is the meaning of this affair? And what's so brilliant is he doesn't confront his wife about the affair, and in fact wants to kind of escape confronting his wife about the affair, where she sleeps with a young actor. And in fact, when his wife tells him that she wants to really speak to him and have a very serious talk, he intentionally drives longer than he usually does, suggesting that he is perhaps trying to avoid having the conversation where the real is unveiled, which would be the collapse of the symbolic order. The symbolic being the kind of fake imaginary that people operate between one another to avoid the real. And what does his wife die of? Like a brain aneurysm, as I understand it. Her brain blows up. You could say that's a little crude, but eventually the gymnastics, you could say, of the symbolic, the imaginary, the real become too much, and the brain gives out. And it's not a suicide, it kind of borders, is it suicide, is it not? She's not murdered, her brain just fails. And perhaps that's ultimately what happens to all of us. We just act from the bottom of our heart until our brain simply fails. So then there's this big question. His wife stresses that she loves him, from the bottom of her heart. And there's a question of if it's fake. It kind of feels fake. It feels like he doesn't mean it. It's just lines. And of course, this whole story is about acting. And that's really, is all of life acting. And is to point that out really getting anywhere because, we can act from the bottom of our heart. It's also very important, I think, that the sex act seems to be associated with smoking. He smokes after he sees the affair. He smokes anytime. I think smoking is the symbol. I think it's dangerous to talk about symbols because we can reduce something to symbols, but we can at least say that smoking seems to be the link between the sex act and the encounter of the real. Because there's also examples where the characters like the driver and him smoke as they talk about the real, as they confront the possibilities of the real, and they smoke. She even buries the cigarette, the driver, at the end of the shambles of her house to suggest that the cigarette, the symbol of the real, has returned to the absent, the great lack at the center of her life. There is no home. She comes back and it's just rubble. It's not there. There is no home to return to. There is a lack. And symbolically, the cigarette seems to connect the sex act with that lack. There's another part where the main character finds out that his eye is failing, that he might be able to drive, but he can't, but he's kind of in a wreck, but it's not a serious wreck, so his eye doesn't work, which of course might be symbolic that he doesn't want to see what he's seen. Where he doesn't want to have good sight. But of course that might take away from him the ability to drive. But it's never direct. This is kind of the brilliance. It's never directly said that he can't drive because he can't see. It's only when he goes eventually to the acting gig that he is told that a previous actor ran over someone and that he won't be allowed to drive. So we never find out for sure if he would have been in that crash because he's losing his sight. It's not completely clear. Instead, the woman, the female driver, takes over. A few things about the female driver, and I will, in this conversation, forgive me, it's right off the cuff of what I've seen. If I go around in the film, I will ask for your forgiveness. You must watch the film. I highly suggest it. The female driver is quite interesting. Lacan has a part where he says there is no woman. Of course, this is tongue-in-cheek. But he wants to be kind of talking about the woman as this symbolic source of desire is not real, ultimately. It's just a projection. It's not what we think it is. Obviously, Lacan is not saying that there is no biological woman, estrogen, and so on. He is saying that the woman as this perfect source of desire is problematic, that it will always be lacking. It's very interesting that the driver is somewhat dressed like a male. She's a more masculine woman. She kind of blends the line between the feminine and the masculine, and that's quite interesting. And in a way, the main character, the protagonist, outsources the direction of his life to this more androgynous individual. So he's gradually being driven away from the imaginary and the symbolic toward the real. Yes, there's a woman that's doing it. One cannot go to the radical real, cannot have no woman at all. And in fact, the driver seems to function as a stand-in for his dead daughter. But again, one cannot encounter the real so suddenly. It has to be gradual. They can't drive to her lost home at the start. They have to work up to the place where they can do that. It is also important to note how in the sex act at the beginning of the movie, they're telling stories. The wife is telling a story with the man. As if fantasy is needed. And really, it's interesting because the sex is very dry and empty until the woman starts narrating a story. And then the sex seems to be more desired, again, suggesting that sex requires fantasy. And that would be very Lacanian. Another thing that I find very interesting is when he's in the car going over his lines for the Chekhov play. He talks about there's these lines where he's like, you don't know how miserable I am. And this is before he finds out his wife is dead. So he's in the car. He knows about the affair with the young actor. And he's talking about how miserable life is. But then he comes home and finds his wife is dead. And so what's so interesting is there's this notion that he'd been happier had he been stuck, had the affair and been able to deny the affair. Like pretend like it wasn't there, but maybe he couldn't have sustained that. Maybe he needed his wife to die to maintain that symbolic order. It's not clear how long could have he acted in that condition. He knew that his wife, we find out later that he knew that his wife slept with other men, but we really don't know to what degree he personally encountered it other than that one time where he comes home early. Did he see his wife sleeping with other men more often or just that time? It's not clear, but it seems to be different when he actually sees his wife engaging in the affair. I'm not sure. That's kind of left ambiguous. But the point is that's so curious is he talks about Like when he's repeating these lines about how miserable he is, we don't know if he's just repeating his lines from the play or if he really means it, collapsing the line, the border between the acting and the real. It simply will not do. This is kind of a main overarching point. We're very tempted to think that what Lacan is describing is the fake. And there's a sense in which it is, yes, where the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, this kind of trinity, the psychoanalytical trinity, is a kind of fakeness. But really, we can only say it's fake if we could access the absolute truth, if we could be God, if we could access the ontic. Lacan basically wants to say we can't get to the ontic, which is kind of this pure truth, independent of an observer, even if we might get glimmers of the ontic in a scientific experiment. Really, we can't get to the ontic. We're always dealing with the real. And the moment you're dealing with the real, you're dealing with the subject. And the moment you're dealing with the subject, you're dealing with something that wouldn't exist if humans never came into existence. And so there's already a kind of symbolic, there's even a kind of symbolic, there's a kind of fake, there's a kind of unreality that's part of everything. But that's why it's so curious. It's so great that Lacan basically calls this unreal, this thing that cannot be found in materiality. He calls it the real because that is ultimately all humans can deal with. Humans can never get to the universe that would be there if humans didn't exist, the ontic. We're always dealing with the real. So it simply will not do to describe Lacan as talking about fakeness. And some people can have the impression that the name of the game is to get to the true self, that we overcome this fakeness, if you will, and get to the truth. Well, we don't. And in fact, the idea that we can get to the true self can kind of function in service of eco-preservation, the preservation, you'll see people like capitalism will now talk about buy this product to get to your true self, have this experience to get to your true self. What ends up happening is the true self just gets absorbed into the ideological structure that keeps us in our place in the socioeconomic order. And I was speaking with Andrew about how creativity can do that to the idea of creativity as opposed to the actual creative act, which I think is actually very good and does in fact increase the quality of life for human beings. But very often, what can actually happen is creativity comes in service of ideology. Likewise, the true self can come in service of ideology. So we have to do something more complex. So the line between acting and the real, it's very difficult to discover that and to figure out where that is. So we don't know when he's in the car saying how miserable I am, if it's true. We assume it's true because he saw his wife sleeping with someone else, but later on he talks as if he knew that was always going on. So maybe it wasn't much of a shock. Maybe that's just something he came to accept as part of what was necessary for her to be alive after the death of their daughter, for her to tell her stories. It's hard to say. But part of the brilliance is then he finds his wife is dead. And so it's kind of like, oh, you weren't miserable. Now you really are miserable because the real has broken through. The notion that you were miserable at that point was just part of the symbolic and imaginary order. It was part of the ego and it was part of the symbolic order, but it wasn't really the real. Well, now she's dead and now you really are miserable. I thought that was a brilliant move of the movie and the story. What's very interesting is when he starts, he's always listening to these lines for the play in the car. And, we kind of, it's not really weird. We kind of accept it as we watch it. He's driving. It's something that drives him. It's how he drives himself. He's part of this acting, and it's something we accept. And then, though, when the female driver starts driving the car and he listens to these tapes, it's kind of weird now. It's kind of bizarre. It's kind of like, wow, this is kind of freaky. That makes me think of the Sardian gaze. And it makes me think of the role of the other intruding into our symbolic and imaginary order to make us see ourselves. And that's really, really hard. And how the role of the other is kind of to make us realize that we're acting. But here's the brilliance of the film. He doesn't turn the cassette off. She doesn't turn the cassette off. They keep acting. They figure out a way to incorporate the driver into the symbolic order. We never stop acting. We can't. If we're waiting for Godot, if we're waiting for a true self to show up, it does not. Now, before I forget, it's interesting that the end of the film returns with a kind of waiting for Godot, because does that mean but what's so brilliant is it's not clear if that is escapism or if it's just what we must do. If we must kind of act from the bottom of our heart, and I'll return to that. But it's something very interesting. But the introduction of the other into the protagonist's symbolic order suddenly transforms him listening to these lines in the car into something very weird. And it's like overhearing, and it's kind of like an adultery. It feels like an adultery, like him seeing his wife sleeping with someone else. It feels like it's a violation. But it doesn't stop because we can't. We can't stop it. We're stuck dealing with the real. We're stuck dealing with the Trinity. It's also important that he kind of strongly resists the female driver coming into the car. He very much resists it, but eventually he allows it. He has to, basically. And then she's driving him. So there's something also interesting about the idea that we ultimately want someone else to drive our life. We ultimately want someone else to be our drive. We want our drive to be external to us because it's just simply too hard to be our own drive. And perhaps it's impossible because we're always stuck in a trinity of the symbolic, imaginary, and the real. We just can't be our own drive. We have to exist with others, which is very strange because we have to exist with others who we can never be totally part of. In the bringing of those others make us feel our lack and make us realize how weird we are, and yet we need them. And this is the complicated structure that we find ourselves having to come to terms with. And we have to act our heart out. We have to act from the bottom of our heart to make the most of it. So on this point, it is interesting to think that there's a kind of like the driver is doing the driving for us, which we resist. But it's interesting because it's kind of like usually to let someone else do your driving, you're not taking responsibility, which is bad and can actually lead to totalitarianism. And there are many psychoanalytical thinkers, and Eric Fromm and whatever, who escape from freedom, who talk about that. But there's also a sense in which that can be a good thing as a vulnerability that helps us come to terms with the real. So it's a bothness, it's a necessary risk, it would seem. And I find that very interesting. Another reason why this film screams Lacan to me is because of language, the role of language in the story. Language for Lacan is kind of the structure of the symbolic order, the structure of the ego, the structure of the imaginary, and that we are always already in language. So for Lacan, language is a big deal. Not simply because Lacan is trying to figure out how to close the gap between like the signifier and the signified, not because Lacan necessarily thinks that language unveils some sort of Platonic truth, we could go on, but that the fact we have to structure ourselves according to language, and language has to be something we're always already in, and language necessarily reflects a culture, well then we're already in the symbolic, bam. And if we indeed structure our ego according to language, then bam, we're always already incorporating the symbolic very deeply into ourselves. And there are so many characters that have different languages. We have English, we have Japanese, we have Korean, we have sign language, which I'm very partial to in my own work in sign language. And I really think sign language is powerful in the ways that it can open philosophical doors. You know, people will talk about learning Greek, learning Latin, so on and so forth, to open philosophical thought. I think sign language can do some very unique things like that. But there's this idea that different people bring with them different languages and therefore different symbolic orders. And so when you have a play, this is what's very interesting, when you have a play that's incorporating different languages, it's very representative of the social order as a whole. People are bringing different egos, different subjects, and they're learning to get along and deal with one another. And indeed, every time a character, you'll have Japanese being spoken, then suddenly English, and it absolutely feels like a new world. That's one of the most brilliant parts of the movie. When there's a switch in language, it just feels like it's a different film all of a sudden, and it's just a fantastic case study of why Lacan is right about language. There is also a part where one of the characters says, "If I don't learn the dialogue, I can't act. If I don't learn the dialogue, I can't act." Yeah, if you don't learn the language, you can't be part of the symbolic order. Yeah, if you don't learn the language, you can't have an imaginary. If you don't learn language, you're stuck with the real, and none of us can do that, so we have to all learn our dialogue. We all have to learn our language. There's another part with so this is another brilliant move in the story. The young actor, who the protagonist saw sleeping with his wife, comes out for the play that the protagonist will be directing. I believe he's the director, that he'll be directing. And this is something so important, he never ever directly, I didn't see it in the film, someone correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he even told the driver this, never does the protagonist say that the young actor is the one who slept with his wife. He says that his wife slept with other men, but I don't believe he ever says that the young actor is the one who slept with his wife. There's a lack. There's a real that is never ever fully put into language, because if it did, it would perhaps destroy everything. It would destroy the symbolic order. It would be too much of a breaking in of the real, and it would be too much, and maybe the brain would blow up, just like the wife at the beginning. Hard to say. But the closest we get to the protagonist getting to the real is telling people that his wife slept with other men. And then kind of the touching part where the driver brings to his attention the possibility that his wife could have slept with other men and yet still loved him uniquely. And that's a possibility that doesn't really fit easily into the symbolic order that he's used to. It's not something that socially you'd be prepared for, but he realizes that it's a possibility and then incorporates it and keeps driving forward, we would assume. But of course, even that is unknown, because after he's told about, doing the best we can and serving God, he's gone. He's out of the movie, and we just have the driver driving the car, and he's not there. What's there is a dog, and that might have significance. But moving forward, another part in the movie that's very good is when the young actor comes to audition, and the older actor, he knows that he slept with his wife, but it's never said. It stays the real that never enters into language. And the actor, basically the female that he auditions with, it's almost like a rape scene, but it's not clearly a rape scene. But at some point, the protagonist stands up and he makes a loud noise. Something that's brilliant is that the camera doesn't turn to show the protagonist standing up and getting upset. We just know that it occurred because of the sound. So again, this is just another example where you can't really separate the symbolic from the real. They blur, milk and dye. They must always go together. Something that's very interesting to me that I'd be curious to hear thoughts on is why the young actor hates having his picture taken. Is there something about the camera in it? He's doing theater. He's not doing movies. And it would be curious to wonder why. That there seems to be something about the camera that is an encounter of the real for the young actor, to the point where he eventually commits murder because he has his picture taken. Does the camera make the entire trinity of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real too visual as a whole? Does it make it too vivid and it's too overwhelming to accept that this is the nature of the world? Is that what the camera does? Because the camera blurs the line precisely because of the enframement, perhaps, the Heideggerian enframement that it puts us in. That if the very noise, the very click reminds us of our enframement and we can't stand it and we lose our mind. Whereas what we want to do is participate in the Lacanian Trinity. I'm going to just call it the Lacanian Trinity from now on. Is it where we want to participate in the Lacanian Trinity and not know about it and not be conscious of it so we can do it real? Whereas the sound of the camera, the click, makes it all way too vivid, makes it all too known, too clear, and we can't handle that. We all, in a sense, are enframed. It's a Heideggerian term, but there's a sense in which we're all enframed in the Lacanian Trinity, and we do not like that, and we don't want to be reminded of that. And the young actor, it seems on the news, he was guilty of an affair with a minor, and maybe the click of the camera reminded him of everything he lost because of his inability to hold himself back from sex. Now, that's also something to note, this kind of inability to hold oneself back from sex, and that being a source of trouble. The affair, which, is arguably a problem, or not, because it's the source of the symbolic. The lines blur, it becomes difficult. But it would seem that the young actor's inability to avoid sex causes him trouble. He's late for the acting that day. It seems to be because of sex. I think he even said that. I can't quite remember. I'd have to go back on the film. Sex gets him into trouble. And it's interesting to think of sex as the punishment, as Pancha will talk about, where you realize you can never get, that you can never escape the Lacanian Trinity, that you can never get wholeness. And it would seem that is kind of what occurs, and sex gets him into trouble, and maybe the camera reminds him of sex as punishment, that sex cannot help you escape the acting, the Trinity that we are stuck in. And perhaps, where he says, I feel so empty, he says, I'm always empty. This, perhaps the camera click reminds him of that, to the point where it drives him to committing a murder. And another thing that's brilliant is we don't see the murder that the young actor commits when he beats the guy up who takes his picture. That is also a lack, that is a real, that is lacking from the story. And he must have done it quick, because he chased after that guy and then he came right back down. So he must have just beat the crap out of him super fast. Assuming that's the same person, and I'm assuming it is, who took the picture. And then we have this tremendous scene in the car with the young actor and the protagonist where, the protagonist tells the young actor that he knew that his wife slept with other men and that created the story. And we really do have a brilliant description of how sex creates the symbolic and the imaginary in Lacan, and so on and so forth. And of course, what's brilliant is it feels like he is telling the young actor, I know what you did. And he's calling the young actor out, but he actually never does. He comes so close to the real, so close to putting into language, but doesn't. And yet for the viewer, it's clear as day, because we know. There is a question, I am curious on the meta dimension of this film, how it plays on what the viewer knows. Are we God? Are we God for this? Because we know what actually happened and we can see the interplay of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. Whereas the characters then cannot. They can't see all of these operations, and that's curious if we're supposed to be the big other, if the viewer of the film is the quote-unquote big other. And when the girl does the sign language at the end, if they're pointing to us, and if ultimately the characters in the movie are acting for us. Are they all acting from the bottom of their heart for us? And are we all doing the same for one another? I think there is a meta dimension to this story. Anyway, we're kind of, are we driving the actors by watching the film? Are we driving them forward? Are we the drivers? Or are we along for the ride? The lines blur. The title of the movie, Drive My Car, is almost like an invitation for the viewer to drive the car. We're driving the car. We're driving my car. Are we driving our car, the car we own, or are we driving the car belonging to the characters? It's both always. It's always already both. And that's part of the brilliance. But anyways, in the car, and he's telling the story. And then it turns out that the young actor knew something that the husband did not. He knew how the story continued to go, where the woman told the story about going into the house and always leaving a part of her as evidence he was there, and it's kind of sexual. And then one day she's going to be caught, but she can't resist, pleasing herself in the bed. And it turns out it's a burglar, and she carries out a murder. And this will obviously overlay with the young actor who may be telling this story. Here's the funny thing. We don't actually know if this is true, that the wife told him this part of the story, that maybe he's just adding his part. Because in the same way that the wife would tell these fantasy stories to get at the real without getting at it too directly, so the young man might be doing the same. Then again, maybe not. It's not clear. But also, if the young man, the young actor, is in fact just claiming that this story is real, that it's from the wife when it's not, there's this interesting part where the story ends where he stands in front of the surveillance camera and he says, I did it, I killed him. Which is kind of interesting because it's like he couldn't stand the camera and it drove him to kill somebody. But then the only way he can he longs for the camera then to see who he really is. So there's this way in which we hate the real when, we hate being forced to see the Lacanian Trinity. But then once we have and we've responded to it, then we kind of want to almost confess, it would seem, how badly we reacted to learning the truth of the Lacanian Trinity. There's this interesting play on confession. It makes me think of what Foucault had to say on confession. Foucault was very interesting on confession because he saw confession as a method of control. But I understand the later Foucault kind of admired it because it was a way that people it was a social mechanism of putting into language the real. And that was a social mechanism, and without the church now, or with a weaker church, you don't have these mechanisms of confession. So Foucault's interesting on confession. That would be worth an analysis of its own. Anyway, you see here this interesting desire for confession and hatred of the real, of which we then later want to confess. Very strange how we are as human beings. The driver tells the actor that she's like, he meant what he said, right? She's kind of like, he wasn't lying. But what's interesting is he easily could have been expressing a truth, but he was lying about ascribing it to the wife. We don't know. That's what's interesting. It's like it could be a lie, and yet even if it's a lie, it's not a lie. That's another thing that happens here in Lacan, that the lie is the truth. That the truth is the lie. Precisely because we can never fully get at the real. Well, if we can never fully get at the real because we can't handle it, dang it, well then all truth has to entail some element of a lie. But that doesn't mean that the lie is bad. It's just kind of like necessary, simply because we always need a mediation. We always need some degree of mediation. So that's a very interesting dynamic of how the confession of the young actor, or the young actor's need to encounter the real, gets blurred with ascribing it to the wife. Which, again, in of itself might be part of the need of mediation. You can't handle to say that it's your story. You have to say that it's someone else. You need that other. You need that big other, if you will. You need that other to deal with the real. You need someone to drive you. You need someone to be at the wheel and taking you where you need to go that you can blame, because if you're in a wreck, you can say it was the driver's fault. And I meant to note, that's where it's kind of interesting, where the female driver is a good driver. So you can't, they're a good driver, they're a better driver than you. And so you can trust them, you can let them drive. You can't rationalize not letting them drive because they're a bad driver. You have to let them take you where you need to go. If you believe in a perfect God, well, then you have to follow the perfect God. But what's so interesting about this other is that it drives you more toward the real as opposed to away from the real. And it's interesting to think, if you talk about God, there are ways in which God can be an escapist, but there's also ways in which God can force you to confess your sin. God can force you to encounter the real because you have to admit that you're a sinner. And it's very interesting how the big other, the other, can both be a source of escape and can be a source of forcing confession. You could almost make distinctions between the big other and the other. And God, in some circumstances, can be the big other, but in other ways, God can be the other. The big other and the otherness that you see, say, in Hegel, from the movement of self-consciousness to reason, which is when AA becomes AB, but that is another conversation for another time. One of the last things I'll note of that story is there's this idea that something terrible happened, but the world didn't change. So, she left this, but, in the story, she killed the burglar, left the burglar in the room and left, and expected the next day to be called out. But no one says anything. But she knows they saw the body. They had to have, and yet people pretend like they didn't. The only difference is the surveillance camera. And that's a pretty good description of what humans actually do. Like, when we encounter the real, we take precautions to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's the key with the surveillance camera. Why is the surveillance camera there? It's not necessarily because we want to encounter the real. We want to make sure we don't have further encounters of the real. So we put a surveillance camera up to stop another burglar, but we're never going to put it into language. Because if we put it into language, it will get us. But they stand in front of the camera and confess. And this is what is interesting, is the world's just going to ignore the person who brings about the real, even in a confession. And this is what I think is very interesting. It is not merely the subject who wants to avoid the real, but the world as a whole has ways of avoiding the real. And an individual who wants to encounter the real, to perhaps confess or to overcome their guilt, and that's why the Russians are interesting. Guilt is a big thing in, like, a Dostoevsky, most famously in Raskolnikov. But the world doesn't want your confession, because then the world would have to incorporate your confession in the real that it brings, and the world does not like that. And so the symbolic order, the world, has ways of avoiding it. To cut to when the young actor, eventually the police break into the play, and they, you find out that the young actor committed murder. It's fantastic how the young actor bows. He bows in a way that's kind of comical. It's like he's ending a performance, and the performance here would be the fact that he kept acting. He kept doing his job, even though he had a murder. He knew he had committed murder, and yet he continued to act as if there was nothing wrong. In the same way that the person driving the car is, able to keep driving the car, even though she ultimately killed her mother. She keeps driving the car, even though the protagonist knows his wife cheated on him. He keeps going. Oh, and that reminds me how fascinating it is. As soon as he sees that his wife commits an affair, the next thing he's back in a play. So he's back in the symbolic order. He's back in the imaginary. So that's the first thing he does. And so, when the young actor bows, what's very interesting, whereas in Dostoevsky, characters cannot, Raskolnikov has to confess. The guilt eats him alive. There's this idea in which the young actor, like not ever breaking character, is the honorable side. Whereas in, say, Crime and Punishment, the honor comes when the character finally confesses. But what's very interesting is here it is suggested that there's a kind of nobility to keep acting, to hide the real. That there's a nobility in this, in a way, as long as you're acting from the bottom of your heart. The brilliance ultimately will be the suggestion that there is a kind of honor and beauty and goodness in the acting from the bottom of one's heart. The maintaining of the performance, even if there's a terrible real that one is hiding, that there's something impressive about the ability to keep going. It is precisely that we cannot escape the Lacanian trinity. And that can have a terror to it, a kind of like hopelessness to it. But what we see here is the possibility of there being a kind of nobility in living that triangle well. We have to live with it. We're only human. We have to do our best to live with it. And that there's a possible nobility in doing it well, even if it's, you could say, well, my gosh, Daniel, you're saying he concealed a murder. Yeah, and that's not good. Obviously, I'm not saying murder is good, but the story is suggesting the possibility of a kind of nobility in acting from the bottom of our heart, which is fascinating. And it kind of suggests, it makes me think of Dr. Last's work on Nietzsche and the overcoming of the human, that there's something here suggesting of what it looks like to overcome the human. To not be all too human, but to overcome the human in a way where you overcome the condition of the human, which is this Lacanian triangle, and actually somehow rise to its occasion and create a nobility in that very triangle. This is where then the message of the story is incredibly positive in a remarkable way, where Lacan, like living Lacan rel, isn't positive. It displays a kind of positiveness in it, and obviously this really comes out toward the end of the story. To continue on, there's the part where when the driver, so we find out that he has to cancel the play or not. Either the protagonist has to be Uncle Varna or the play has to be over. And he's given 2 days to decide. And there's something like terrible about the idea of continuing a play when you just found out there's a murder. And yet, as we're getting at, the brilliance here is it kind of reverses it and suggests there's a nobility of it. We find out that it's a murder, and basically the people, one of the first things they say is, but what's important is continuing the play. And that sounds so terrible. But if we understand that we must maintain the symbolic and the imaginary to survive, then what's really important is the play. So we maintain the Lacanian trinity, and the real doesn't break through and destroy us all. And he takes 2 days to decide. And one of my favorite dialogues here is he says, I want to see your hometown, to the driver. And the driver says, there's nothing there. Is that okay? So often nothing there equals we're not going. It's a bad idea. I don't want to take you. But it's like, is there nothing there? There's nothing there. Is that okay? And she's like, yeah. And he goes, yeah. He wants to see the nothing. He wants to see the lack. So they're going to go see the lack. They're going to go see the nothing. What's brilliant is she tells him it's a lack. It's not where she says, okay, and they take him and you find out it's a lack. She tells him ahead of time it's going to be a lack, and he still wants to go. This is brilliant. In a lot of movies, you'll go and there will be nothing there, but you won't know there's going to be nothing there before you get there, or the camera won't show that there's nothing there. We are told that there's going to be nothing there, and yet we go. This is the extraordinary Lacanian move, and this is where it's kind of hopeful. This is where the hope begins. Because we know nothing's going to be there. It's not going to be the shock of the real. We know we're just going to encounter the real. So we got our preset complexes. It's going to be incorporated into the symbolic in the imaginary. And yet we go to the place where it can be better incorporated into the symbolic and the imaginary. We're never going to get to the absolute real, but we can incorporate our limits better. And I think this is like absolute knowing, basically. We integrate with the lack, not run from it. We integrate with the real into the symbolic and the imaginary best we can. So he goes to the lack. Along the way, we find out that the driver feels like she killed her mother. He feels like he killed his wife, and he says something like, if I was your father, I tell you it wasn't your fault, but I'm not your father, it was your fault. This is another brilliant idea, because he says yes. So that's an idea that parents are actors, but they're not going to be actors here. They're just going to look at the real, and they say yes. And yet, they also have to encounter the real in a manner of ambiguity, where he didn't directly kill his wife. He just didn't come home on time. She didn't directly kill her mom. She didn't do the landslide, but she didn't do more per se. She didn't do more, so she's a participatory. But notice how there it's not a full radical encounter with the real. There's a little bit of mediation in the uncertainty. It's interesting how the journey is very long, how she doesn't sleep, that there's just this drive. It seems like desire, desire is so big in Lacan, and obviously Drive My Car, I haven't mentioned desire, but desire is permeating the whole thing, and how we come to terms with desire. We want to be great actors. We want to be seen, but that's all that desire has to be balanced with the Lacanian trinity. It's interesting where we find out the driver's mother had schizophrenia, which I wonder if pointing to Deleuze here, and a movement into Deleuze, and how the schizophrenic, there's a comfort. So the driver lost her mother and best friend at the same time. And it would be interesting to examine Sachi, that she cried a lot, the alternative personality to the mother, that she liked puzzles. And obviously the schizophrenia here is connected, if it's schizophrenia or multi-personality disorder, is tied to acting. And she says, I'm not sure if it was acting or a mental illness. Which then, of course, is Lacan, because you love your symptom. The symptom is love. The symptom was her best friend. And this is, Zizek is always talking about come to love your symptom. And basically, we all have a symptom because we're all acting. And practically speaking, there's little difference between acting and mental illness. Practically, not obviously, there's real difference that requires treatment. I'm not meaning to say that, but in a practical sense, the lines blur. And it simply will not do to suggest that one is fake and the other is real, because we can't get to the ontic. We're stuck with the real, and the real entails an unreal. The real always has a UN in parentheses ahead of it, per se. And this, of course, I think is where we get the main line of the entire story. Even if acting, it was from the bottom of her heart, is what the driver says about her mother. Even if acting, it was from the bottom of her heart. And the mother is returned to the womb. Freud, the mother is the first other. The mother kind of represents the home. And even the mother is, in this role of acting. But the difference is that even if the mother is acting, it's from the bottom of her heart. And this is also where Murakami is suggesting a solution to the problem of irony that David Foster Wallace was concerned with, the loss of sincerity. He's suggesting a new sincerity. But this new sincerity is from a place of a deep understanding of the challenges of Lacan. And that's why this is such a remarkable story. I think it is quite special in being part of the new sincerity movement. And yet it's from a place of Lacan. It's a Lacanian new sincerity, which is extraordinary. The story will end with it turns out that the protagonist indeed came back to Chekhov. He accepted the play. He's going to fill in for the young actor. He told us earlier that the real comes out in Chekhov. That's why he can't do Chekhov anymore. So he's facing the real, and yet it's funny because it's a play. So, the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real blur. He goes into Chekhov. He goes back into the play, because that's where we must find our sincerity in the play. He has a gun at one point, and we wonder if he's going to shoot himself on stage. We wonder, and maybe he did after the prayer scene, if you will, with the death girl. Maybe he did. It's not clear. But what's so fascinating, the deaf girl with sign language seems to be a different world than all the other characters. And the sign language would probably deserve its own examination. But we get the final prayer talking about how we need to keep living. And in the end, God will take our suffering to God and we'll be praised for it. And the sign language starts off very beautiful, but then it feels ridiculous. And then it feels beautiful. And there is a straight up movement there's like a movement, a Hegelian movement, negation, all of sublation, all this it's this movement from beauty to comedy to ridiculousness to sincerity. And it all happens in that prayer. And it's just remarkable. The prayer feels like a denial of Samuel Beckett. And then at one point it feels like it's from the bottom of the heart. So it doesn't matter. It is from the bottom of the heart, and that's the best we can do. And then religion is, even if religion is fake, even it's acting, it's from the bottom of our heart, and that's the best we can do. All we can do is from the bottom of our heart and that's the best we can do. All we can do is live with the Lacanian triangle from the bottom of our heart. And that prayer suggests that. And it's beautiful that it's sign language, because sign language is a new language, therefore it breaks through. It's a new symbolic order. It's something different. It won't fit in English. It strikes us like an entirely new world, because it is not English, it is not Japanese, it is not subtitles. It is sign language. And that's going to be a more foreign language to most people viewing it. And therefore it can strike them anew. We don't have as many preset complexes about sign language. And so it can hit us differently. And the sign language ends with a kind of pointing, if I recall, and maybe that's pointing to us as the viewer. And so this entire movie has involved actors who have been acting for us. They have made this movie for us as the audience. And the question is, do we feel like the actors in this movie acted from the bottom of their hearts? And I personally feel as if they did. And so even if it's just a story, it matters. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.